The Philadelphia Experiment. I work in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., cataloging and organizing government documents. It's a monotonous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me away from people, exactly how I like it. Most days are the same, long hours of sorting, through dusty files and yellowed reports, most of which are so heavily redacted that they're practically useless. But last week, something different happened. I was assigned to a restricted section in the lower levels of the building, a cold, dimly lit room that smelled faintly of mold and aged paper. The documents here were older, dating back to the 1930s and 40s, many of them sealed in classified envelopes. My job was simple: organize them by date, document them, and report anything unusual. After hours of work, I found it. A thin, unmarked file wedged between two heavily classified folders. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I slid it out, sat down at my desk under the flickering fluorescent light, and opened it. Inside were black and white photographs of a large naval ship, the USS Eldridge. Some of the pictures were blurry, distorted, like they'd been taken in the middle of a storm. Others showed the ship docked, surrounded by sailors whose faces were either turned away or blurred beyond recognition. Then I saw the reports, pages of typed documents with the words Project Rainbow stamped across the top in bold letters. They described a series of experiments conducted by the US Navy in 1943. According to the reports, the goal was to render the ship invisible to radar using powerful magnetic fields. But something went wrong, horribly wrong. Testimonies from surviving crew members described how the ship disappeared from the Philadelphia Naval Yard for several minutes, and then reappeared miles away off the coast of Virginia. When it returned, some of the crew were different. The words used in the reports stuck with me: disoriented, unresponsive, irreparably damaged. One document mentioned that several men were found partially fused to the ship's metal hull. Their limbs and torsos melted into the steel like wax. Others simply vanished. My hands were shaking, my breath quickened. This couldn't be real, right? Then I saw the last page. A list of classified follow-ups, all stamped with the date December 10th, 1965, more than 2 decades after the experiment supposedly happened. The final note read, "Containment measures remain in effect. Further investigation not recommended." A sudden chill crawled down my spine. My office felt colder. I stood up and rubbed my arms, trying to shake the feeling off. Just then, my desk phone rang. It was almost midnight. No one ever called me this late. Hesitantly, I picked up the receiver. A deep, static-filled voice whispered on the other end, "Stop looking, or you'll end up like them." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hand still clutching the receiver. My heart hammered against my chest. I glanced at the file still open on my desk, at the grainy photos of the USS Eldridge and the blurred faces of the crew, and then I noticed something I hadn't before. In the corner of one of the photographs, almost hidden by shadows, was a figure standing at the edge of the ship. A tall man in a naval uniform. His face was pale, eyes sunken and hollow, but the thing that made my stomach drop was that he was staring directly at the camera. Directly at me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, hollow eyes staring at me from the corner of the photograph. The static-filled voice on the phone echoed in my mind. "Stop looking, or you'll end up like them." But how could I stop? I had to know the truth. The next morning, I called in sick and spent the day digging through old military records online. Most information about the USS Eldridge was classified or lost, but I found whispers, old forum posts, conspiracy theories, and vague interviews with former Navy personnel. That's how I found him. Thomas Beckett, a former sailor who had served aboard the Eldridge during the Philadelphia experiment. The article said he was still alive, living in a small town in Pennsylvania. I called the number listed, but no one answered. I left a message, not expecting a response. But that night, my phone rang. "You shouldn't have found me," the voice on the other end rasped. "Mr. Beckett?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was silence, then a sigh. "Meet me tomorrow, 3 p.m., the old diner on Main Street." He hung up before I could respond. The next day I drove 3 hours to a weathered diner in a quiet Pennsylvania town. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. Only one man was sitting at the back booth, hunched over, wearing a faded navy jacket with a patch that read USS Eldridge. He watched me approach with sunken, bloodshot eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. "You're the one. Asking about the experiment," he said without looking up. I sat across from him. "Yes, I need to know what happened," he scoffed. "You think you want to know." I slid the folder across the table. He stared at it for a long moment before opening it. His eyes darkened. "Where did you get this?" "The National Archives." "You weren't supposed to see this." His voice was cold, but I did. "And now someone's threatening me." He leaned back and took a deep drag from his cigarette. "Of course they are. You've already gone too far." I pressed him. "What happened that day?" "The reports say the ship disappeared, that men were fused into the hull." He flinched at the word fused. "It's worse than that." His eyes glazed over as he spoke, like he was replaying it all in his mind. "They told us it was a cloaking experiment, something to make the ship invisible to radar. We were stationed at the Philadelphia Naval Yard when the test began. The ship started to hum, a deep, low vibration that made your bones shake. Then the fog rolled in. His hands began to shake. I don't know if it was from the ship or if something else came through, but the ship disappeared all right. It wasn't just invisible, it was gone." He swallowed hard. "When it came back, some of the men were..." He trailed off. "It was like their bodies had been absorbed into the ship. Arms melted into the walls, faces half sunk into steel, screaming, but they couldn't die." A tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly. "But that wasn't the worst part," he whispered. "Some of the men came back different." "What do you mean?" "They weren't the same men who left. Their eyes empty, like something else was looking out from inside them." He leaned in close, his breath reeking of nicotine and fear. "And some men never came back at all. We thought they were dead, but some nights we could hear them, calling to us from inside the ship." My mouth went dry. "And the government covered it up?" He laughed bitterly. "They tried to destroy the ship, but you can't destroy something like that. Not when it's alive." "Alive?" He leaned back, his eyes dark. "It's still out there. And sometimes, late at night, you can still hear them calling." Suddenly, his face twisted in pain. He clutched his chest, gasping for air. His eyes widened in terror as he stared over my shoulder. "They found me," he whispered. "Run." I spun around and saw nothing, but the diner felt wrong. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy, charged with static. Beckett's head slammed against the table. His nose was bleeding. His mouth opened as if he was trying to scream, but only a horrible gurgling sound came out. His body convulsed, and then he went still. Blood dripped from his mouth. His eyes were wide open. I stood there, frozen in shock. That's when I heard it. A deep, low hum, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I ran out of the diner. I don't even remember how I got back to my car. When I tried to call 911, the line was filled with static, and as I pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the pale face of the man from the photograph sitting in the back seat, smiling. I don't remember driving home. My hands were still shaking when I stumbled through the front door and locked it behind me. My heart was racing so fast it hurt. Beckett was dead. He had died in front of me, and I still had no idea how or why. All I knew was that something unnatural had happened, and now it was following me. I sat on the floor of my living room, clutching the folder of documents Beckett had left behind. The hum I'd heard at the diner. It was still in my ears, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to pulse in the back of my skull. I needed answers. I dumped the contents of the folder onto the floor. Photographs, technical schematics, handwritten notes, all marked with official Navy insignias. There were autopsy reports, grainy black and white images of twisted bodies, men whose faces were melted into the steel walls of the ship. Some were frozen mid-scream. One report caught my eye. Handwritten and stamped, classified. It was dated October 28, 1943, the day of the experiment. Subject USS Eldridge. Aftermath report status: compromised casualties 37, confirmed deceased 14, missing 9, unresponsive condition of survivors, severe psychological trauma. Subjects exhibit signs of disassociation, unresponsiveness, and unnatural behavior. Unnatural behavior. There were more notes beneath it, hastily written, almost illegible. The survivors, they see things we can't see. One of the men, Ensign Wallace, disappeared from his room overnight. No sign of forced entry. Crew members report hearing voices inside the ship's hull. They say the missing men are still there, trapped. We've sealed off the lower decks. The Admiral says it's for safety, but I think it's to keep them in. I flipped to the next page. A grainy photograph of a young sailor with dark eyes and a stiff smile. The name beneath it read, Ensign Michael Wallace. My stomach dropped. It was the same face from the photograph, the same man who had been sitting in the back of my car. Suddenly, the hum in my ears grew louder. I dropped the paper and pressed my hands against my temples. My head felt like it was about to split open, and then 3 knocks on the door. My head shot up. My breath hitched in my throat. Knock, 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 slow and deliberate. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away from the door. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I pulled it out, I saw an unknown number on the screen. I answered it, my hand shaking. Hello? A deep, static-filled voice responded. You were warned. My vision blurred. My legs gave out beneath me and I sank to the floor. Who is this? The voice chuckled, a cold, hollow sound. He's watching you. The line went dead. I forced myself to stand. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the documents off the floor and shoved them back into the folder. I had to get out. I needed to clear my head, figure out my next move. I stuffed the folder into my backpack and headed toward the door, but stopped when I saw something in the corner of the room. A dark figure stood in the shadows. My breath hitched. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its head tilted slightly to one side, and its eyes were completely white. I stumbled backward, crashing into the table. My phone hit the floor with a loud crack. It stepped toward me. No! I gasped. I ran for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the night. My heart slammed against my chest as I stumbled into the street, glancing over my shoulder. The figure stood in the doorway, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight, and it was smiling. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and locked it. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. My headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated a figure standing at the end of the driveway. Ensign Michael Wallace. He stood there, his dark eyes fixed on me. His mouth curled into a cold smile. The hum returned, louder this time. My vision swam as the pressure built in my skull. I hit the gas. The car sped down the street. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove for nearly an hour before I pulled over on the side of the road, gasping for air. My hands were white-knuckled around the steering wheel. I reached for my phone to call for help, but it was still back on the floor of my apartment, and that's when I noticed something sticking out of my backpack. A photograph. I pulled it out with shaking hands. It was the same picture from Beckett's file, the one of the crew, but now the faces of the sailors were blurred, distorted, except for one, Michael Wallace. His face was clear. His eyes seemed to be looking right at me, and this time, he was smiling. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, Michael Wallace, smiling, watching me. I sat in my car until the sun came up, parked on a side road outside of town. My mind was spinning, heart still racing from what had happened. I needed answers. I opened the folder again, flipping through the documents until I found what I was looking for. The last recorded location of the USS Eldridge before it was decommissioned. It was docked at a naval scrapyard in Philadelphia, and I had to see it for myself. The drive to the naval yard was a blur. I barely remember checking in at the front gate, flashing a fake press badge I'd made years ago for a different story. The guard barely looked at it. He waved me through without a second glance. The place was deserted. Rusting hulls of old destroyers and battleships lined the pier, their faded numbers barely visible beneath years of salt and decay. And then I saw it. The USS Eldridge. It sat at the far end of the yard, surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. The metal was rusted and stained with age. The deck was lined with weathered lifeboats and broken antennas. It shouldn't have been there. A ship like that should have been stripped down and dismantled decades ago. But there it was, forgotten, abandoned. I parked the car and walked toward the gate. It was unlocked, of course it was. I hesitated, looking around. No one was watching. The whole place felt dead. I pushed the gate open and stepped onto the gangway. My footsteps echoed across the hollow deck as I climbed aboard. The air smelled stale, like rust and mold. The ship creaked beneath my feet as I walked toward the bridge. My heart pounded in my ears. The hum was back, faint but growing stronger with every step. I reached the door to the lower decks. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. A dark hallway stretched before me, lined with open hatches and rusted pipes. The hum grew louder. My chest tightened. The air was thicker down here, humid and stale. I turned on my flashlight and stepped. Inside, the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the damp metal walls. Strange symbols were scratched into the steel. Spirals, geometric patterns, shapes that didn't make sense. And then I saw it, a set of deep, ragged gouges. In the wall, like fingernail marks, a chill ran through me. I stepped closer, raising my flashlight. The gouges formed words, "Help me." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hallway. I spun around, heart racing. "Hello?" No response. I took a cautious step forward, and the lights above me flickered. The hum grew deafening. My vision blurred. I pressed my hands to my temples as the pressure built in my skull. And then, whispers. Low, broken voices filled the corridor. My flashlight flickered and died. I fumbled with it, my breath quickening. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man wearing a navy uniform, the name Wallace stitched across the chest. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes milky white, his mouth curled into that same twisted smile. My breath hitched. "Michael?" He cocked his head, his lips parted, but his voice was not his own. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled back. My foot hit something solid, a metal hatch. I turned, yanked it open, and scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind me. Darkness swallowed me. My breath echoed off the metal walls. My fingers fumbled for the flashlight, but it was gone. I turned and froze. In the dim light, I could make out a long corridor stretching ahead of me. But something was wrong. The walls were shifting, breathing. Footsteps echoed behind me, slow, measured. "Help me!" I whipped around. Michael Wallace stood at the end of the corridor, his milky eyes reflecting the faint light. His mouth curled into a smile. "You can't leave." I backed away, heart racing. My hand brushed against something cold and smooth. A switch. I flipped it. Blinding flash of white light erupted down the corridor. A deep guttural scream filled the air. I shielded my eyes as the ship vibrated violently beneath my feet. The hum was deafening now. My vision swam. The corridor twisted and bent, the walls folding in on themselves. I stumbled forward, blind and desperate, until my hand hit a door handle. I threw it open and fell through. I landed hard on the deck. Cold night air hit my face. I scrambled to my feet and slammed the door shut behind me. When I turned around, I was back on the deck of the ship. The hum was gone. The ship was silent, but standing at the far end of the deck was Michael Wallace, his eyes locked on mine. His smile widened, and then he vanished. I stumbled toward the gangway, legs trembling. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I drove away without looking back, but as I pulled out of the naval yard, I saw something in my rear-view mirror. A figure standing beneath the glow of the security lights. Michael Wallace, and he was smiling. I didn't go home. I couldn't. I drove for hours, aimlessly trying to piece together what had happened. My hands were still shaking on the wheel, and my head was pounding from the hum. Even though it was gone now, at least I hoped it. As I pulled into a motel off the highway once the sun started coming up. It was one of those nameless places with flickering neon signs and cigarette burns on the furniture. I didn't care. I just needed to breathe. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and collapsed on the bed. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, Michael Wallace, standing beneath those security lights, smiling, and the ship, the eldridge, the twisting metal, the whispers. I forced myself up and dumped the contents of the folder onto the bed. Papers scattered everywhere. I sifted through them until I found what I was looking for, the list of surviving crew members. One name stood out. James Kearney. The last confirmed sighting of him was in 1998 at a psychiatric facility outside of Baltimore. I grabbed my keys and hit the road. The hospital was old, red brick and ivy covered with high iron gates. A thin nurse at the front desk gave me a tired look when I asked about James Kearney. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Kearney is not accepting visitors." I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "I'm working on a story about the Philadelphia experiment. I think Mr. Kearney might have answers I need." She sighed and glanced toward the hallway behind her. "He's not well, but if you promise not to upset him, I'll give you 5 minutes." I nodded and followed her down the corridor. The place smelled like bleach and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The nurse stopped in front of a door and unlocked it. "Don't stay too long," she said, and then she left me, alone. I stepped inside. James Kearney was sitting by the window in a worn armchair. He was thin and pale, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that stared at nothing. His white hospital gown hung loosely on his frame. "Mr. Kearney," I said softly. His head turned slowly toward me. His eyes were cloudy, but there was a strange sharpness beneath them, like he was seeing more than just me. "You shouldn't have gone to the ship," he said, his voice dry and brittle. My breath hitched. "You know about that?" "I was there," he whispered. His eyes darkened. "I remember the hum, the light, the metal, folding. What happened that day?" I stepped closer. He smiled faintly. "They told us it was to protect us, to make the ship invisible to radar. But it wasn't about radar. It was about something else." I swallowed hard. "What?" "They were trying to tear through the fabric of reality." His hands twitched on the armrests. "To open a door. And they succeeded." A chill ran down my spine. "Where did the ship go?" I asked. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Not where, when." I froze. "Time travel," he shook his head. "No, they didn't just travel through time. They slipped into Another place. A place not meant for us. His eyes glazed over, and something came back with them. My mouth went dry. Michael Wallace? James's head jerked up. You saw him? Yes. He leaned forward, eyes wide. He's not Wallace anymore. The men who disappeared, some of them never came back, but some of them changed. A cold weight settled in my chest. What happened to the others? James's eyes darkened. They're still there. A loud bang sounded from the hallway, making me jump. James flinched, his gaze shifting toward the door. It's not over, he whispered. They opened a door they couldn't close. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? James's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes widened. His hands clawed at the armrests. His face twisted in panic. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The hum was back, vibrating through the floor, through the walls. No! James screamed. He's here! The door flew open. The nurse rushed in, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rising hum. James thrashed in his chair, screaming. I stumbled back as the lights overhead exploded in a shower of sparks. The hum grew so loud, I thought my skull would split open, and then James stopped moving. The hum vanished. The room fell deadly silent. The nurse leaned over him, pressing her fingers to his neck. She shook her head. He's gone. I staggered toward the door, clutching the frame for support. My head was spinning. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sir? The nurse's voice was faint. Are you all right? I shook my head and stumbled into the hallway. I needed to get out of there. I didn't stop moving until I was in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel. My breath came in ragged bursts, and then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, Michael Wallace. His face was pale and empty. His eyes locked on mine. I slammed my foot on the gas and peeled out of the lot. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely steer. But as I turned onto the road, the hum started again, low, persistent, and growing louder. I glanced into the rearview mirror. Michael Wallace was still there, and this time, he was smiling.